Good afternoon, everyone. It's Steve Lookner with Right Side Broadcasting coming to you with a news alert. Former Florida school officer Scott Peterson, he was the one who Sheriff Israel of Broward County criticized last week for not entering the building during the school shooting. He was the school officer who stood outside the building for 4 minutes during the school shooting, and Scott Israel gave a press conference where he talked about how upset he was about this, and he basically called out this officer for not entering the building, as Scott Israel said he should have during the shooting. Well, Scott Peterson today offered an alibi, offered a reason why he didn't enter the building, and offered a statement saying that Scott Israel was wrong to criticize him, and Scott Israel has his facts wrong. And so we have a big disagreement about what went on there. We have the sheriff saying one thing, this officer, who technically I believe works for the sheriff's department, I believe he's a sheriff's deputy, but he at least had been working for the sheriff's department previously. But anyways, big disagreement here between the sheriff, Scott Israel, who claims that this officer should have gone into that building, and the officer, Scott Peterson himself, who's saying this is, through his lawyer, this is wrong, he should not have gone into the building. And the big point, I'm going to read you the statement from Scott Peterson's lawyer, but the big point of the alibi is Scott Peterson says that he thought the shooting was coming from outside the building, and because he thought the shooting was coming from outside the building, the proper thing to do was not to go inside the building. That's really the essence of his alibi. I'm going to read you the statement right now. It's quite an interesting statement, very interesting statement from Scott Peterson's lawyer. Also, very interesting to me, I just turned on none of the mainstream media news channels covering this story right now. None of them. Literally, this is such an important part of this investigation. None of them are covering it, but we're covering it here, so we want to cover it for you. So, by the way, thank you. I want to make sure, let me just make sure the sound's working okay. To me, I just turned on. You can hear me. That's good. Thank you for the donation, by the way, Happy Camper. Happy Camper says, thanks for this. God bless RSBN. We are viewer supported, so if you like that we're covering the story, whereas the mainstream media isn't covering it, basically, the news networks aren't covering it at all, you can donate by doing what Happy Camper did. Go to the bottom of the YouTube chat, click on the $sign at the bottom of the YouTube chat. We are viewer supported. Your donations keep us on the air. So click on the $sign at the bottom of the YouTube chat or go to rsbn.tv/donate, rsbn.tv/donate. Now let's get to the statement. I'm going to read you the statement of Scott Peterson's lawyer, which has some quotes from Scott Peterson in it. All right, here's the statement. Let's get to it. Again, just to recap here. Sheriff Scott Israel of Broward County was critical of Scott Peterson. He said, Scott Peterson was the armed officer hired to work at the high school, Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School, where the school shooting occurred. And Sheriff Scott Israel said, during the shooting, there's video that shows that the officer, Scott Peterson, didn't go outside the building, stood outside for the building for 4 minutes during the shooting. And Scott Israel was very critical of this officer because of that. Now, this is the response today we're hearing from Scott Peterson. Okay, for immediate release, this just came out, I believe in the last hour, but definitely today, regarding Scott Peterson's actions at Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School. Here is the statement. To the South Florida community and the American public, Scott Peterson has hired attorney Joseph A. DeRuzo III to assist Mr. Peterson in responding to what Mr. Peterson knows to be unfounded criticism of his actions on February 14th and uncalled for attacks upon his character by, among others, Broward County Sheriff Scott Israel. On Thursday, February 22nd, Sheriff Israel held a press conference a mere 8 days after the tragedy and accused Mr. Peterson of failing to respond appropriately, with the clear implication that Mr. Peterson was responsible for failing to help the students of Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School. Sheriff Israel has maligned Mr. Peterson, even though Mr. Peterson has a decorated career with the Broward Sheriff's Office, including receiving glowing annual performance reviews and being named the School Resource Officer of the Year in 2014 for Parkland. Further, Sheriff Israel has made his accusations at a time when he has admitted that the Florida Department of Law Enforcement's investigation is ongoing in what Israel himself characterizes as a fluid investigation. Let's keep going here. Hang on one second. I'm scrolling up. Let there be no mistake. Oops, I went down too far. Hang on one second. Let me do this so you can see me and the text. Let there be no mistake. Mr. Peterson wishes that he could have prevented the untimely passing of the 17 victims on that day, and his heart goes out to the families of the victims in their time of need. However, the allegations that Mr. Peterson was a coward and that his performance under the circumstances failed to meet the standards of police officers are patently untrue. Mr. Peterson is confident that his actions on that day were appropriate under the circumstances and that the video, together with the eyewitness testimony of those on the scene, will exonerate him of any subpar performance. Sheriff Israel has indicated that the video may never be released to the public, but then commentated on the very same video to allege that Mr. Peterson took up a position on the west side of the building, but that Mr. Peterson never went into the building. Sheriff Israel's statement is at best this is like a typo. There's a couple typos here. Sheriff's statement is at best a gross oversimplification of the events that transpired. Sheriff Israel's February 22nd statement conveniently admitted the following facts for the public's consideration. And that footnote 1 there means the quoted portions of the bullet points are attributable to Mr. Peterson and the media may quote it as such. So everything in quotes is you can say it's directly from Mr. Peterson, not just his lawyer. Now we're getting into the alibi here. The rest of this, once we get into the bullet points, here is Scott Peterson's alibi for why he did not go into the building during the school shooting and why that was appropriate conduct by him. Bullet point 1. Mr. Peterson initially received a call of firecrackers and not gunfire in the area of the 1200 building. So Peterson says the first call he got was firecrackers and not gunfire in the area of the 1200 building. All right, let's keep going. Hang on. Now what I need to do is to fit this all on the screen, I need to just get the second page up on here. It's not in a very convenient format for me to show, so let me get page 2 up here for you so I can show it to you. Okay, here is page 2, and let me just shrink it so that I can put it on the screen. Hang on, it'll be about 10 seconds here. Okay, here we go. Let's continue. Oops. Yeah, let's continue here. Continuing with Scott Peterson's alibi here. Let me scroll down a little bit to get it out from under me. In response to the firecracker call, Mr. Peterson, along with security specialist Kelvin Greenleaf, exited the 100 building and ran north the couple hundred yards to the 1200 building. So Scott Peterson says he first got a call of some firecrackers, then he ran to the 1200 building. Next, upon arriving at the 1200 building, Mr. Peterson heard gunshots, but believed that those gunshots were originating from outside of any of the buildings on the school campus. That's a very important statement here. Scott Peterson is claiming that when he got to the building where the shooting was happening, he did hear gunshots, but he believed those gunshots were originating from outside any of the buildings on the campus. That is, to me, that is the linchpin of his alibi here. He's saying, look, I heard gunshots. They didn't sound to me like they were coming from the buildings. They sounded like they were coming from outside. And an important point here about this part of the alibi, he's not saying he was told the gunshots were coming from outside. So he's not saying anything. When he makes the claim he thinks they were coming from outside, there's no there's no other evidence besides that you can use to corroborate that statement or show it to be false. Because all he's doing, well, unless he said to somebody, I think the shots are coming from inside. Now, he does say, we'll see later, he told somebody he thought the shots were coming from outside. But again, His claim is that he thought they were coming from outside. Now, he does say later, though, that he told somebody he thought the shots were coming from outside. Anyways, okay, so Scott Peterson, he gets to the building, he hears gunshots, but he thinks they're coming from outside, not from inside any of the buildings. Next bullet point. Broward Sheriff's Office, is that what that is? BSO, trains its officers that in the event of outdoor gunfire, one is to seek cover and assess the situation in order to communicate what one observes to other law enforcement. Consistent with his training, Mr. Peterson took up a tactical position between the 700 and 800 buildings, quarter/corner. Mr. Peterson was the first BSO officer to advise BSO dispatch that he heard shots fired. So again, Peterson's saying, I got a call saying some firecrackers were going off. I run to the 1200 building. I hear gunshots. I think they're coming from outside. So I do what procedure says I should do, which is I take cover nearby. That's what he basically is saying. The first police officer that arrived on scene was from the Coral Springs Police Department. So this is Peterson's already there, but the first police officer, so not a school officer, that arrives on scene, according to Peterson, was from the Coral Springs Police Department. Mr. Peterson informed this Coral Springs police officer that he thought the shots were coming from outside. This Coral Springs police officer took up a tactical position approximately 20 yards away from Mr. Peterson behind a tree with his rifle. Now, I would think that they can interview this Coral Springs police officer and ask, hey, did Scott Peterson tell you that he thought the shots were coming from outside? Now, it's interesting to me because if there's a witness. If this Coral Springs officer goes on record and says, Scott Peterson came up to me and told me he thought the shots were coming from outside, then it's less like, then that's significant because if Scott Peterson told no one he thought the shots were coming from outside during the event, but then later said, I thought the shots were coming from outside, that's why I didn't go in, you might think, oh, well, maybe he's just making up this story about what he thought after the fact to cover for the fact that he was scared to go in. But that's certainly less likely if, while this incident is going on, he goes up to a Coral Springs police officer and says, I think the shots are coming from outside. I mean, technically speaking, he could just be lying to the Coral Springs officer, but it seems to make it more likely that he genuinely thought the shots were coming from outside. If when the Coral Springs police officer showed up, the first other officer besides Peterson showed up, he said to him, I think the shots are coming from outside. So we'll see if the Coral Springs police officer ends up corroborating this claim from Scott Peterson. The behavior of the Coral Springs police officer seems to indicate that he did hear this from Scott Peterson because it says this Coral Springs police officer took up a tactical position approximately 20 yards away from Mr. Peterson behind a tree with his rifle. So look, if Scott Peterson genuinely did think this was, well, let me say this. In addition to Scott Peterson not going in, we've heard reports that 3 other officers did not go in. Oh, but those weren't Coral Springs officers. All right, scratch that. I forget I said that. Forget that point. Maybe we'll come back to that later. Let's continue, though. Okay. So the Coral Springs police officer, first officer, shows up on the scene. Scott Peterson says, I told him that I think the shooting's coming from outside. So this Coral Springs officer joins Scott Peterson, taking up a tactical position and does not go inside the building. Now, the next bullet point says here from Scott Peterson's lawyer, and it's a quote from Scott Peterson, radio transmissions indicated that there was a gunshot victim in the area of the football field, which served to confirm Mr. Peterson's belief that the shooter or shooters were outside. Now, this is a little odd because, look. So what Scott Peterson's saying is, hey, I got on my radio as I'm sitting there outside the school thinking the shots are coming from outside. I hear a radio transmission that says there's a gunshot victim in the area of the football field, which confirmed my belief that the shooter was outside. But, it's possible that it's certainly when you hear that there's a gunshot victim in the area of the football field, that doesn't necessarily mean the shooter is there. I mean, it could mean that the person walked out to the person could have walked out to the football field, or the shooter could have shot that person earlier. So, again, make of that what you will. I could see it confirming his belief, but I could see somebody saying, well, that shouldn't make him believe the shooter is necessarily outside. But he's saying he already had that belief, and this report confirmed that belief for him. Mr. Peterson, it then says, Mr. Peterson had the presence of mind to have the school administrators go to the school's video room to review the closed-circuit cameras to locate the shooter, and then, that's the fourth typo I've seen, I believe. It's crazy to me that this statement came out, and there's so many typos in this statement. It's not good. And then obtain a description for law enforcement. Mr. Peterson, I have to remind myself about that. I might tweet about that later. Mr. Peterson had the presence of mind to have the school administrators. I already read that one. Mr. Peterson provided his keys to the Coral Springs SWAT team so that they could enter the 1200 building. That's a bit odd. The 1200 building is where the shooting happened, I believe. So it seems like he's taking credit for giving them the keys, but he didn't go in the building. Anyways, Mr. Peterson provided BSO SWAT command with handwritten diagrams of the entire Stoneman Douglas campus for student evacuation. And then Peterson's lawyer says, we note that Sheriff Israel's accusations are wholly inconsistent with the position he has taken in response to Representative Bill Hager's criticisms. It is our understanding that Sheriff Israel acknowledged that the investigation remains ongoing and that investigations will not be rushed or asked to jump to conclusions. But this is exactly what Sheriff Israel did. He jumped to a conclusion regarding Mr. Peterson's performance on February 14th, even though Israel claims that it is more important for us to wait and let the investigators get it right. We question why this statement would not also apply to Mr. Peterson. So what Scott Peterson's lawyer is saying is, look, Sheriff Israel has gotten all this criticism about his and his department's behavior in this incident, and he has said things like, we're not going to rush the investigation. People shouldn't jump to conclusions. We should wait and let the investigators get it right. But if he's saying that about the criticism of himself, why shouldn't he think the same thing about the criticism of Scott Peterson? And then the last part of this is, Mr. Peterson is looking forward to cooperating with the Florida Department of Law Enforcement's investigation, which we hope will detail the events of that tragic day and which we believe will ultimately clear Mr. Peterson's name. Kind regards, Joseph A. DeRuzo III. So again, really the key part of this alibi here, the key part of Scott Peterson's alibi here is he says when he heard the gunshots, he believed they were coming from outside. So there would be no reason for him to go into the building. And he also says, not only did he believe that, he says he told the first outside police officer to show up on the scene, a Coral Springs officer. Scott Peterson says he told that officer, hey, I think the gunshots are coming from outside. So he's not just saying, I believed on that day that I thought the shots were coming from outside, but there's no really way you can corroborate that at all. As part of the he thinks that corroborating evidence for that would be that you can, ask the Coral Springs police officer who showed up right as this was happening and ask him what I told him. That's at least his story. So it'll be really interesting to see. I'm guessing they'll interview the Coral Springs police officer, and will that Coral Springs police officer confirm that Scott Peterson told him he thought the shots were coming from outside? I would like to know what you think about this. Do you buy Scott Peterson's story or not? And what do you think about his alibi? Give me a shout on Twitter @Lookner. I'm going to take your comments now. Thank you to Barbara Braley for moderating in the YouTube chat room, and Common Sense and Gleno for moderating on the website. And again, we are covering the story. We think it's an important story. Last I checked, mainstream media was on TV was not talking about it. Hang on. It's really funny. So CNN is interviewing Rick Scott about the school massacre now, but they're not talking about this breaking news which just came out, at least that I've seen. I've turned on CNN 3 times. And they haven't. I've turned on MSNBC 3 times in the last 45 minutes. They're not talking about it. They're just talking about Trump's statement about running into the school. And Fox News is they're talking about Trump and school safety, but they're not talking about the breaking news about the actual event. So people don't seem to want to talk about this on the news, but we're talking about it. We think it's important. If you like our coverage, we are viewer supported. Your donations are what keeps us on the air. So if you like the coverage, please consider donating. You can donate by going to the bottom of the YouTube chat, click on the $ sign at the bottom of the YouTube chat, or go to rsbn.tv/donate, rsbn.tv/donate. All right, let me take your comments on this alibi. What do you think about this? Write to me on Twitter at Lookner. Brian N. writes in, Steve, one would think the gunfire location should be obvious to properly trained professionals. There is a big difference in gunfire sound from inside a building compared to outside a building. I personally do not accept his alibi. Thank you, Brian. That's a very interesting comment you make. And I was thinking about this as well, Brian. And I don't know because I'm not a trained professional, but what would a trained law enforcement official think about Scott Peterson's claim, hey, I thought the gunshots were coming from outside the building? Because you think, Brian, that a trained professional, it should be obvious to them whether gunshots are coming from inside or outside a building. Now, I will say, again, an important piece of information, and a very important claim here, is that Scott Peterson not only says, I believe the gunshots were coming from outside, he said he told a Coral Springs officer, who was the first officer who showed up after Scott Peterson, he says he told the Coral Springs officer, as soon as the Coral Springs officer showed up, I think the gunshots are coming from outside. So it's a little odd that if he was like making this up and didn't really believe that, he would tell the Coral Springs officer that. Now, maybe someone might say, okay, well, maybe he did think they were coming from outside, but that just means he's really incompetent. Now, I will say this though: if he's incompetent, then is he no longer liable, and it's the department's fault for hiring somebody who was not competent to do the job? So. But an interesting question, Brian, as to whether the normal trained school officer it would be pretty easy for them to tell whether gunshots were coming from inside or not. Rocky Sanchez writes in, thank you, Steve, for covering facts, something the fake news media have forgotten to do. Every day, there are pieces of information that leads us to question the narrative of Sheriff Scott Israel wants us to believe. Media outlets like Right Side Broadcasting are more important than ever. Thank you, Rocky. Mr. Nicktown made a donation. Mr. Nicktown said, everyone pitch in. Thank you, Mr. Nicktown. Made a very generous donation and said, everyone pitch in. If we want honest media, we're going to have to contribute. Steve, thanks for taking a run at this. Thank you, Mr. Nicktown. That helps us stay on the air, so we really appreciate it. We're taking your comments on the air now. What do you think about Scott Peterson's alibi that he says he thought the gunshots were coming from outside and that's why he didn't go in the building during the school shooting? And also, he says he told another officer right at the time, I think the gunshots are coming from outside. That's what he says. So write to me with your comments at Lookner on Twitter. Jeremy Miller says, if the shooter was outside, why did he give Coral Springs his keys to enter? Tells me Coral Springs knew it was inside. So, yeah, we were talking about this before, Jeremy, and it's this part of his lawyer's letter said he seems to take credit, Scott Peterson. It says Mr. Peterson provided his keys to the Coral Springs SWAT team so that they could enter the 1200 building. And as I said before, I was like, well, why is he trying to take credit for that? That would seem like he's avoiding entering the building. Now, there's no context to that, though. For all you know, Coral Springs SWAT said to Scott Peterson, when they figured out the shooter was no longer in the building and no longer on campus, maybe that's when Coral Springs SWAT said, hey, anyone have keys to this building? It's locked. We heard there might be victims in there. And Scott Peterson gave them the keys. So, it's possible that happened not right when the shooting happened. So it's a perfectly fair question. Jeremy, why did he give the keys to them rather than going in the building himself? But we also should point out that we don't really know the context of him giving them the keys and why he did it and when exactly during the incident this happened and all that. Gabai TBP USA Patriot 1776 says, how come security specialist Kelvin Greenleaf ran to the 1200 building and Peterson took a tactical position between the 700 and 800 building? Fishy, I don't believe his alibi. So, well, when Scott Peterson first heard the report of the firecracker, he ran to the 1200 building. And then he thought the shots were coming from outside, so Peterson took up a position between the 700 and 800 building. You're talking about Kevin Greenleaf. That's not in... Kevin Greenleaf is not mentioned in this... Kevin Greenleaf is not mentioned in this memo, so I can't really... Or in this press release, so I can't really answer your question about that. All I can say is what the... and Peterson did initially run to the 1200 building. According to the memo, he did initially run to the 1200 building, but then he says, I'm sorry. I got it. Kevin Greenleaf is up here. I missed it. Let me take it back. Here we go. I got it. At the top here, it says, I missed this. Mr. Peterson, along with Kevin, in response to the firecracker call, security specialist Kevin Greenleaf exited the 100 building along with Mr. Peterson and ran north a couple hundred yards to 1200 building. So Kevin Greenleaf and Scott Peterson both went to the 1200 building. I'm sorry, I missed the name. But initially, Kevin Greenleaf and Scott Peterson both went to the 1200 building. And hang on one second. Let me stop my phone from ringing. And you're saying, why did Mr. Peterson take up a tactical position between the 700 and 800 building? Well, we don't know what happened to Kevin Greenleaf after that. For all we know, Kevin Greenleaf was in the same place as Scott Peterson. All we know about Kevin Greenleaf is that he, along with Scott Peterson, initially ran to the 1200 building. That's all we know about Kevin Greenleaf right now. Sorry for the confusion on that. Guy Ingham says, I believe Peterson. I think he did what he was trained to do. So Guy Ingham believes Peterson. Look, it's certainly possible Peterson is telling the truth and that he really thought the gunshots were coming from outside and that was what he was trained to do. Now, if it's the case that what Peterson's saying is true, then in that case, it seems absolutely horrible that Sheriff Israel would go on basically national TV, give a press conference that was transmitted nationally, probably internationally, and call out Scott Peterson for improper conduct. Sheriff Scott Israel said Scott Peterson should have been in that building. He blamed Scott Peterson. He said he should have been in that building. He should have killed the killer. He should have stopped the shooting. So if it's true, if what Scott Peterson is saying is true, that means Sheriff Israel went on national TV and criticized and blamed Scott Peterson for something that wasn't Scott Peterson's fault. So one side or the other isn't telling the truth here, or is wrong here. But it's very interesting. I will say this, though. Let me say this. If it's true that if Scott Peterson's telling the truth and saying, I thought the gunshots were outside, and I told a Coral Springs officer that day during the shooting incident that I think the shots are coming from outside, it's very odd that Sheriff Israel wouldn't at least mention that in his big national press conference where he called out and blamed Scott Peterson. Because you'd think during the press conference, if it's a national press conference and Scott Israel, the sheriff, is blaming this officer, Scott Peterson, he'd at least say, well, Scott Peterson says he thought the shots were coming from outside, but I still think Scott Peterson should have went in the building. But Sheriff Israel said none of that during his press conference. He basically just said, Scott Peterson didn't go inside and he should have gone inside. I think he said something like, hold on a second. I want to get the quotes here from the press conference. Hang on here. I have an autoplay video I got to stop before I show you this. Sorry, I'm trying to find the exact quotes from Scott Peterson, from Scott Israel. Here it is. I think. Yes, here we go. This is from Vox. During the press conference, Scott Israel's press conference, the sheriff, Broward sheriff, he said, "Ask what the officer should have done." Israel responded, "Went in, addressed the killer, killed the killer." So he said in his press conference that Scott Peterson should have gone in and that Scott Peterson acted wrongly. He never mentioned Scott Peterson's claim that Scott Peterson thought that the shooting was coming from outside. So it's kind of odd that he went on national TV and blamed this officer without at least giving you what the officer's excuse was. I would presume at that point he knew the officer's excuse. Had he not talked to the officer yet? Very, very odd. The whole thing is very odd. Hey, thank you for the donation, a very generous donation from Beamer Boy from Canada. Beamer Boy says, RSBN Steve and the mods rock. Keep up the good reporting. By the way, this is Brian N. on Twitter. Thank you, Brian N. very much. We appreciate it. We're taking your comments on the air about this. Alibi being given by Scott Peterson that he says he thought the shooting was coming from outside the building, not inside the building. And he told a Coral Springs police officer that during the incident. Joey Diaz writes in, it seems, if you want to comment, give me a shout on Twitter, at Lookner, at Lookner, at Lookner. Joey Diaz says, it seems like you would be able to hear where the gunshots were coming from, but it happened fast. Scott may have not done anything wrong. Look, yeah, this wasn't like, I'm not an expert, so I can't tell how obvious it should be to somebody, an officer, where shots are coming from. But you do raise a good point that it happened fast, Joey. I mean, he went to the building, the shooting was going on, it's not like he had 20 minutes to sit there and figure out where the shots were coming from. He kind of just heard right away and made a judgment. He was probably pretty maybe nervous when he heard the gunshots. So I don't know. Some people, experts I'm guessing have a view on whether he should have known these shots were coming from inside or whether that's too hard to tell. I don't know. Oh, Carol is raising an interesting point. Carol is saying crews fired outside and inside the building. Now, I will say, though, so let me just get something right here. When Scott Peterson was at that building, though, shooting was reportedly, from what I understand, at least from what the sheriff said, going on inside the building. That's at least what Sheriff Israel said. He said Scott Peterson was outside the building for 4 minutes while shooting was going on inside the building. That's what the sheriff said. But you're saying I would like to get a better answer on where exactly Cruz fired all his shots. Hang on a second. So this story here, this is a CNN story, says Cruz entered the school, activated the fire alarm. He roamed the halls, targeting students. he dropped his rifle and backpack on the third floor. So according to this CNN story, all the shots were inside the building. The CNN story says he activated a fire alarm from inside the school after entering the school through a stairwell and all. So this story from CNN says all the shots came from inside the building, actually. We're taking your comments here. Let me read more of your comments. Rare Patriot says, thanks for the coverage, Steve. My first thoughts of gross negligence by the sheriff has grown into suspicion of his direct involvement in corrupting the investigation. So you think, the sheriff might be corrupting the investigation. I will say this. It's very odd. Information keeps coming out that contradicts what the sheriff says that the sheriff should have known. So a week after the sheriff, at least a week after the shooting, the sheriff was quoted in the New York Times as saying he thought all the officers acted properly. And then a day later, it came out that Scott Peterson never went inside. And at that point, the sheriff said, oh, well, Scott Peterson didn't act properly. He should have gone inside. And then you're like, well, why didn't the sheriff know this for a week before? Hadn't he watched the surveillance video? And now we're hearing that Scott Peterson is saying, look, I thought the shots were coming from outside, and I also told a Coral Springs police officer of this during the shooting incident, which you'd think they could just interview the Coral Springs police officer and confirm that. That would seem like relevant information that Sheriff Israel would have mentioned during his press conference blaming Scott Peterson. Why would the Scott Israel not know that information? If so, why? If he did know it, why wasn't he releasing it? So lots of questions here about Scott Israel coming out and not presenting information, which he really, just reasonably speaking, he should definitely know, and yet not presenting that information and then having that information come out later. It's very odd. Now, Jim Sermon has a good question. Jim Sermon says, if Peterson's excuse is valid, why did the other three Broward officers just stand by the cars? So there were three other Broward officers who also didn't enter the building. But what we don't know is Scott Peterson is the only one I've heard accused of not entering the building during the actual shooting. There were reports that three other Broward officers showed up and never went in the building, but it was never confirmed that the shooting was going on at that time. Now, maybe by the time the three other Broward officers got there, the shooting was over, and maybe Scott Peterson went up to them, or maybe somebody told them, hey, the shooting might be coming from outside. So we don't know what those officers were told and when exactly we got there. So it's a good question, but there's so much we just don't know about them. Brandon says, why did Peterson have to provide keys to the building to the SWAT team? Does this imply the doors were locked? Wouldn't that increase the chance of fatalities if students couldn't get out? So in the lawyer's memo, Scott Peterson's lawyer says Mr. Peterson provided his keys to the Coral Springs SWAT team so they can enter the 1200 building. Now, what I don't know is, I don't know about, was the whole building locked? Was a certain doorway locked? Is locking it is the building perhaps locked from the outside but not the inside? I could definitely see it being the case where you couldn't get in from outside, but you could get out from inside. Perhaps that's their policy. Maybe they lock the buildings at certain points from outside, but not from inside. I don't know. So I would need to know more about how the locks work there. But we can't rule out that they were locked from outside and not inside. But I don't know why that would be. So a good question about the locks, but I just don't know what to say about that right now. I would like to know more about those locks. Reload says, did you say he had gotten a report of a dead body in the football field or that area? If so, would agree with him, thinking it was outside maybe. Well, he says after he already got to the building and heard the shots and thought they were coming from outside, after that, He then heard a radio transmission indicating there was a gunshot victim in the area of the football field, which served to confirm his belief that the shooter or shooters was outside. But that was after he'd already heard gunshots and come to his conclusion that he thought that the shooting was coming from outside. So that didn't help him determine that, because he had already determined that before he'd gotten the report of the victim on the football field. Linda Belk says, I think Scott Peterson should have gotten the corroboration from the Coral Springs officer before putting out this statement. If it's true, so it would lend him more credibility. So what you're saying, Linda, is if it's true that Scott Peterson said to a Coral Springs officer right on that day, right around when this was happening, look, I think the shots are coming from outside, I think you're right in that supports Peterson's claim that he thought the shots were coming from outside. What you're saying, though, is as far as we're aware, Scott Peterson hasn't talked to that officer. We haven't heard a statement from that officer. So we don't know if there is a Coral Springs officer that can corroborate that. And you're saying, since that's an important point in his position, it'd be cool if there was a statement from the Coral Springs officer. Now maybe there are reasons that they couldn't get the statement, or maybe, it's possible you can't just talk to the Coral Springs officer because then they say you're tampering with a witness or something like that. But he wanted to get the statement out there anyway, Scott Peterson, and defend his reputation. So maybe that way he didn't really have a choice. But it's a good point. As I said before, it'll be interesting to see, and it'll be an important point, whether a Coral Springs police officer confirms that Scott Peterson said to him, hey, I think the shooting's coming from outside. Cutter Wayne Leaf says, if I was in his position and believed the shots are outside, I would have identified where the target is so backup does not run into a fatal funnel. Now he says, BSO trains its officers that in the event of outdoor gunfire, one is to seek cover and assess the situation in order to communicate what one observes to other law enforcement. So he's saying the training they give them says, if you think there's outside gunfire, take cover and observe and report it to other law enforcement. That's what he's saying he did. Red Pill Blue State says, here's the thing about Florida schools. They're typically a combo of inside/outside facing classrooms, inside/outside facing classrooms on account of the nice weather. So the source of the gunfire could be completely misleading. Uncle Hotep says, I don't believe Scott Peterson. Why were they facing the building? He is trying to save his behind. Now, I don't know. You say, why were they facing the building? I don't know if they were facing the building and when they were facing the building. To know, I would need to see like a time-stamped video of Scott Peterson along with audio of the gunshots to know whether he was facing the building or not during the gunshots. That information is not in the statement, and I can't confirm that information right now because I have not seen a time-stamped video along with gunshots to know whether Scott Peterson was facing the building or not during the actual shooting. Carol says, Israel says 2 other bodies were discovered outside the school. Another was found a short distance away along a local road. But the thing about that is those people could have walked out of the school or ran out of the school. So that in itself doesn't say the shooting was coming from outside the school. Again, the report on CNN said all the shooting was done inside the school. So if you see a report that says there was actual shooting outside the school, let me know. But so far, I don't recall seeing reports that there was actual shooting outside the school. Base Cafefe says, where are the security camera tapes? What actions by anyone can be verified by video? Start with that skeleton investigation. Well, the security tapes are with law enforcement. They have them now. I don't know if they'll ever be publicly released, but they have them. Tony D made a donation. Tony D said, Steve, you should look into the school you should look into if the school has a Sonatrol security system, very unique system as it uses sound instead of cameras. The Sonatrol operators would have been able to tell law enforcement exactly where the shooter was. Yeah, I am aware there are security systems out there that can tell you where gunshots are coming from. I have heard no reports yet that the school had that kind of system. None. Off the top of my head, I would say that's probably a very expensive system for a school to get, given that the vast majority of schools would never actually use the system. So I wouldn't be surprised if schools generally don't have that system, just because it's probably really expensive given the use you might get out of it, given the statistics, I mean, if you think of all the schools there are in the country, certainly there are, whenever there's one school shooting is too many, but thousands and thousands of schools in the country. So, schools have limited funds too. So my guess is that I'd be surprised if any schools had that kind of system in there. But maybe I'm wrong. Jeremy Miller writes, he had read a timeline that said a 15-year-old student says he encounters crews at 2:23. Police receive multiple calls, 2:25. The shooting stops. A resource officer still has radio communication and had to know he was inside. Why are you saying he had to know he was? Oh, all right. So look. So the question is this. I had thought of this too, but thank you, Jeremy, for reminding me, because I wanted to bring this up, and it's a good point you're making, Jeremy. Presumably, students and teachers were communicating with police from inside the building, calling 911 or texting the police or whatever, and saying there's a shooter here. Now, you might say, well, if the students or people are calling the police from the school and saying there's a shooter here, how does Scott Peterson not know that? But remember, for Scott Peterson to get that information, it's got to go from the police to Scott Peterson. Did the police ever tell Scott Peterson the shooter was inside? It seems like there will be a record of that. But I've heard no communication from the police saying they told him. I've heard no statement from the police saying, we told Scott Peterson the shooter was inside. It seems in the moment they were relying on Scott Peterson to tell them where the shooter was. So it's very possible that during the shooting, when the shooting is going on, Scott Peterson hears these shots, and right at that time, some students pick up their phones and start calling 911. But by the time the students call, I think the shooting only went on for about 6 minutes or something like that. I remember hearing something like that. But let's say the shooting only went on for about 6 minutes or so. Okay? Let's just say that's the case. By the time students hear the shots, call 911, tell 911 what's going on, 911, tells the police department, and then the police department communicates what they've heard to Scott Peterson, that could take minutes and minutes and minutes, and maybe by that time the shooting's just over. So it's entirely viable to me that Scott Peterson would not have been told during the actual shooting of these reports from the students and faculty, maybe, that the shots were coming from inside, because they would have to have gotten that information to Scott Peterson very quickly. And I'm also guessing they'll have a record of whether they told Scott Peterson this. But it's not crazy to me to think that Scott Peterson was never relayed the information about the phone calls that happened during the shooting while the shooting was going on, because, again, just think, you're a student, you hear gunshots, it probably takes you at least a minute or two to even hide and pick up your phone. Then it takes you a minute or two to explain what's going on to the 911 people. Then they have to talk to the police, and the police have to talk to Scott Peterson. It seems very reasonable to think that Scott Peterson would not be told of those calls while the shooting was going on. I don't know what happened. I'm just saying it's not crazy to me to think Scott Peterson would never get this information during the actual shooting. Base Kafefe says, was there a body on the sport field? I don't know exactly where all the bodies were found. I'm guessing if you Google it, you could find that out. Oh, and Carol Newer said that she heard the quote from Scott Aylesbury's press conference that she sent me, if this is accurate, said 2 other bodies were discovered outside the school. Another was found a short distance away along a local road. So a viewer sent me this from Noah. Noah Bertelson says this student's testimony appears to confirm that Scott Peterson was facing the building the shooting was happening in. And a student said, reporting by Brian Enton, a student said he was pointing his gun at nothing. Senior Brandon Huff rushed to the building when he found his girlfriend was inside. She texted me, there's a shooter. The school resource officer was behind a stairwell wall just standing there, and he had his gun drawn, and he was pointing it at the building. Well, I will say this. So he says he was pointing his gun at the building, but again, look, it's a very, at that point, I don't know where the student was. If the student could have been 75 yards away from Scott Peterson, and maybe it kind of looked like Scott Peterson was pointing his gun at the building, but maybe Scott Peterson was pointing his gun somewhere next to the building outside, or, this to me is not, I would not judge on the basis of one student who runs to the building and we don't know where that student was. And, this is not, I grant your point that this is a piece of testimony that says he had his gun drawn, was pointing it at the building, but that's not the only you can't judge from just that one eyewitness report, especially not knowing anything about where the eyewitness was compared to where Scott Peterson was. Maybe he was far away and it looked like Scott Peterson was pointing it at the building, but he was pointing it to the side. So all I'm saying is that's not. I can't conclude just from that's what was happening, but I think it's an interesting piece of evidence that you bring up. So thank you for writing in. Trumping the Globe says, but you just said the school was locked. Now we have kids running out, but cops just get in. Well, what I said, though, Trumping the Globe, is I said the school was locked from outside, apparently. At least there was one door that was locked from outside. But it's very possible there are doors in those schools that can lock from outside, but you can still get out from inside. That has a locking mechanism where you can get out but not in. I believe those doors exist, where there's a door that you can lock from inside, which doesn't allow anybody to get in, but you can still push on a door to get out. I'm sure this is the case because I've been in schools where it's like that, where the door is locked, but somebody can push it and get out from inside. So it can be possible for a door to be locked from outside, but students still be able to get out. Two Lame Ducks says, how did the shooter escape? I mean, the story is that the shooter escaped because he dropped his stuff and blended in with students who were exiting the building. That's the story that the media has been saying. Josh Mansfield says, doesn't the screams from kids inside the building give away that something is going on inside? If it was outside, the kids probably would be quiet and paying attention to where the shots would be coming from. So this is a very interesting question Josh Mansfield brings up, our viewer, and says, wouldn't there have been screaming from people inside the building in chaos and people, and I would add maybe people running out the building, and if that's the case, wouldn't the Scott Peterson hear those screams and conclude that something's going on in the building? I don't know. I don't know if Scott Peterson heard screams. I don't know if the screams might sound like they might echo off another wall and sound like they're coming from outside too. I don't know. Maybe people outside did scream when they heard the shots. So very good question. Those are some of the things I think you'd have to investigate, but it's a worthwhile point to be looked into. Joey Diaz says he's innocent until proven guilty. Unless there's hard evidence of malice or incompetence, we shouldn't assume it. I think that's a good general rule for everyone. Let's see what the evidence says. Scott Peterson said there's video showing the sheriff outside the building, but we haven't even seen that video yet. But even if he's outside the building, his excuse is that, well, I was outside the building because the shots sounded to me like they were coming from outside. So, I agree. We should let's look at the evidence, and that's what we should base our judgments on. Unfortunately, I don't know how much of the evidence we as civilians will see. I hope we see more of the evidence. Kirk Wasson made a donation. Thank you, Kirk, and says funding might be an issue if live streaming is ever revoked. Patreon could stop too. For those who want to be ready, PO boxes on rsbn.tv website. Thank you, Kirk, very much for your donation, and thank you to Tom O'Neill for your donation. Tom says 2 words, Bull S-Blaster. This is a defense against the inevitable lawsuit. Thanks, Steve. RSBN rocks. So you're not really buying Scott Peterson's story. Some people have different, we've heard people having different impressions of Scott Peterson's story, whether you buy it or not. Nicer writes in, eyewitness testimony is notoriously unreliable. In chaotic life-death situations, people are trying to survive, not form memories. The sheriff should be telling the truth, not inspiring a bunch of conspiracy theories by changing the story and trying to cover his ass. And I do think you make a good point about eyewitness testimony. I've read the same thing, that in a stressful situation, an emergency situation, that eyewitness testimony can be unreliable. And so, that will have to be taken into account when we hear people's testimony about the time too. Boog Rose says, hi, Steve. I think the officer's alibi is believable. The physics of acoustics can be very tricky. The facts are all the victims died senselessly because of the shooter, regardless of where backup was. Thank you. Thanks, Boog. Ace Trades made a donation and said just a little help for you all. Thanks, RSBN. Thank you, Ace Trades. Zyder Creole writes, it's ridiculous that Peterson as a cop couldn't tell where the shots were coming from. I don't believe it for a second. He is among the Broward cowards. It's a disgrace and an outrage. James Mins writes, 1, owning a gun. 2, actually drawing and pointing a gun at someone. 3, deciding for real if you could pull the trigger or not. 4, having a gun pointed at you. 5, having a gun fired at you. Don't judge too harshly until you have experienced all of these. I think, James, you're making a general point. If you're making it about me, James, I'm not judging anyone. I'm saying I haven't said anything about whether to believe Scott Peterson or not. I'm just telling you what his lawyer said and what he is saying. Michael M. Brennan writes in, a 223/5.56 round will break the sound barrier. A shot from inside a structure will severely muffle the sound. Outside the building, it will create a loud crack along with an echo. Also, Sergeant Jeff Heinrich heard the shots and immediately ran inside the buildings. All right, well, I think we're going to wrap up this stream right now. We will keep on top of this story, and if there's big news about it, we will cover it on the air, as we do here at Right Side Broadcasting. I will post more news about it on my Twitter if I hear anything new. I post about breaking news all the time. So you can follow me on Twitter, at Lookner, at Lookner. And to know when we're coming on the air, be sure to subscribe to us on YouTube, Right Side Broadcasting on YouTube. Click the notifications bell when you subscribe. Also, you can you can follow us on Facebook, Right Side Broadcasting on Facebook. Speaking of which, I'm going to peek at the Facebook chat right now, and also follow us on Twitter at RSB Network, and a big thanks to people who donated. That's how we can come on the air and give you an alternative to the mainstream media. We're actually to bring you some live coverage of this today, as opposed to When I checked CNN, Fox, and MSNBC before, I checked them 3 times before coming on the air. No one was talking about this story. We're bringing you coverage of it. So if you like that alternative to the mainstream media, please consider donating, because that's how we stay on the air, is your donations. You can donate by going to the bottom of the YouTube chat, or go and clicking on the $ at the bottom of the YouTube chat, or go to rsbn.tv/donate, rsbn.tv/donate. Let's see. Just real quick sampling. Thank you, people on Facebook, for watching, as well as YouTube and Facebook chat. Mandy Cummins says, the sheriff, 4 minutes to scope and search is nothing, and the sheriff called the guy a coward and didn't even know all the facts yet, and didn't bother to mention any of this at the town hall. The sheriff is not good for what he did. Nick Muchmore says, I find hilarious you read none of my comments. Agenda driven much? Nick, we do not get the Facebook comments on the air during the broadcast. That's why if you look, it says send your questions, comments to Steve. It has my Twitter and my email, because I cannot during the broadcast even see the Facebook comments. I'm doing too much producing here. So in general, we only read comments that are made to my Twitter or my email during the broadcast. So no one's being ignored in the Facebook stream and the YouTube stream. It's just I don't see those comments during the broadcast. Kit Kat says in the Facebook chat, all this is getting worse and confusing. And I'm reading a couple Facebook comments now, because at the end of the broadcast, because I do not have a chance to read them during the broadcast, I like to sometimes quickly go to the chat rooms and read a couple comments from the chat rooms that I've missed during the broadcast. Hang on 1 second here. Hang on 1 sec, guys. Somebody just messaged me Sarah Sanders' press briefing soon. They didn't have it on the schedule, and now they're having it. So I guess we'll have to cover it. All right, I got to get off the air. We're going to try to get this press briefing coverage on the air. So thank you for joining us, everybody. Thank you for everybody in the Facebook chat, in the YouTube chat. Thanks to our moderators, JC and Barbara Braley. Thank you so much. And everybody in the YouTube chat who participated. We had our regulars there, people like Timberlab and Rooster and Light Switch and Jerry and Swoosh. And everybody else there, Rocky, I Dan the Man, Music World. So, all right, I'm going to go. We're going to try this briefing, I guess, is happening, White House press briefing. So we'll try to get it on the air for you. But for now, thank you for joining us here at Right Side Broadcasting. We will keep on top of this story. But have a good day from everybody here at Right Side Broadcasting, and we'll see you soon. And we're going to try to get this White House press briefing on the air in the next 15 minutes. Okay, see you soon. Bye.